What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one, it's the Game Week 23 preview, and there's a lot to discuss, such as who's the best Liverpool player to go for. Is it worth using assistant manager on Arne slot? Apparently, people are selling PALMER as well, so I'm going to discuss that as well as other stuff as well. So let's get into it. So who's the best Liverpool player after Salah and Trent? So the four main options for me are probably Gakpo, Van Dijk, Konate and Alisson. You could look at Diaz as well, but I feel like most people's squads at the moment are stacked in midfield and it's easier to fill a forward or a defensive spot instead. And also last night in the Champions League, Gakpo didn't play, got 0 minutes, and Diaz started. So I think if I'm trying to predict which attacker will get the most minutes going forward in the Premier League, it probably is Gakpo. Now, in the next Champions League game, Gakpo might start and Diaz might get benched, but we're trying to work off the information we have right now. In terms of whether you should go for a second attacker or a second defender, that really is a close call, and I'm not trying to sit on the fence here, but a lot of this is going to come down to what your squad looks like right now. So an argument that will be made this week is that the upside is with the attacker, because Ipswich at home and Wolves at home are primed for goals, and Bournemouth away and Everton away in the double is going to be difficult for a clean sheet, so you should go for the attacker. And in some ways that makes a lot of sense, but you might be sat there with a great midfield and a great forward line. Like if you're looking at Gakpo and your front three is Isak, Chris Wood and Visser, for example, you might not want to sell any of them. Whereas you might be looking at your defence thinking, well, I need a bit of an upgrade there. So for you, it might make sense to go for a defender. I'm sat there with Solanke, red flag, not going to play for a couple of weeks. For me, it might make more sense to go for Gakpo. So for example, it could be like Chris Wood and Van Dijk versus Munoz and Gakpo. And when you think of it like that, it's a much closer call. So you're going to have to look at your own team. If you're looking at a defensive option between Van Dijk and Konate is incredible value at 5.1. He also, like Gakpo, was on the bench last night, played 0 minutes. That's pretty encouraging for his minutes in the league moving forward and to keep him fit. So I quite like him at 5.1. If you can afford Van Dijk and it doesn't block you from making any other moves that you want to do over the next few weeks, I do think he's worth that premium at 6.4. His goal threat is better. He doesn't have that concern over injuries. And obviously he's absolutely nailed as well. So I prefer Van Dijk to Konate, but if money is an issue, I don't think it's... I think the risk could be worth it with Konate. And then with Alisson, most people, at least before this season, don't really like premium goalkeepers. They're seen as players that only get 2 or 6 points. I still quite like Alisson, especially if you're not looking to free hit in 29 or wildcard in 30. Because you can just play that Liverpool player all the way through if you've got Fabianski on your bench. Now, this does rely on Fabianski keeping his place, but if Liverpool end up beating Spurs in the Carabao Cup semi-final, they will blank in 29, but Fabianski's got Everton away. So you could just play him that week. And then after the blank in 29, if Liverpool haven't played that week, they'll then probably double in 33. Not a guarantee, but that's quite likely where the game would go. So you then have Alisson after that blank in 29 with Everton at home, Fulham away, West Ham at home, Leicester away, and then you'd have the extra fixture from 29 put into that week as well. So Alisson's quite nice, especially if you're looking for a goalkeeper upgrade. Then you've got to think about whether you want any double game week players for Everton. So if you are wildcarding in 30, Pickford's quite nice in the short term. So Pickford and Van Dijk, I would prefer to Mykolenko and Alisson. So unfortunately, you're going to have to look at your own squad setup. For me right now, Van Dijk is probably the absolute safest one out of all of them. Security of starts, goal threat, clean sheet potential as well. But I think for the upside, as people will say, and if you want an attacker, it probably is Gakpo right now. So is Arne Slot assistant manager in Game Week 24 better than a third Liverpool player? Now, in isolation, Slot will almost certainly outscore that third Liverpool player, and a big reason is you get him for 3 game weeks, but also you're not relying on individual returns. You just need Liverpool as a whole to do well. But is there a better time to use that chip later on? I think Slot in 24 is pretty good. Liverpool will be odds-on favourites to win against both Bournemouth and Everton in the double and Wolves at home in 25. So if they do win all 3 of those games, you're already on 18 points. You add a few more for goals, possible clean sheets. You're maybe hitting 24, 25. And then in Game Week 26, when Liverpool have got Man City away, if you don't want Slot for that week, you could just look to transfer into a different manager. Now, in 26, as things stand, there's not a huge amount of table bonus opportunities, but even if you went for just like Arteta versus West Ham and get another win, all of a sudden you're pushing kind of 30 plus points. If you can get that kind of return from this chip, that's probably quite good. We will want to be pushing more than that, but I think 30 is a good barometer. If you hit that, you're probably in quite a good position. So he's not a bad option slot in 24. My main worry is, as much as I wouldn't put a huge amount of my own money backing against Liverpool for those 2 games in the double, I do see them as potential banana skins. It's not ideal to have 2 away games. Like, Bournemouth will cause Liverpool problems. We saw what they did against Newcastle. And for Everton, it's the final Merseyside derby at Goodison Park. That's not an ideal position to be in. So if Liverpool didn't win one of those games, or maybe both, it would be a little bit shocking because of how good they've been, but not a massive shock. And so I'm just not sure if the upside is there when I know we're going to be able to play this chip later on in different doubles instead. And so for me right now, as someone that could use the chip this week, I'm just hoping that a better opportunity comes up later. And I think what's going through my mind is it's very unlikely that I'll get to later double game weeks and be in a much worse position where there's just no chance of getting a good return from the chip. So that's why I probably won't use it. I think later on I can get a as good option for the assistant manager or better, and I'm willing to wait and find out. If you've got all your chips left, let's say you're going to use your wild card in a non-double and your free hit in a blank, you've got triple captain, assistant manager and bench boost left to use. I would rather use the triple captain this week and look to try and get some table bonus later on. Because if you pick a team that's 5 places below someone else, even if they draw, that's 8 points. And if you get the win, it's 16. Like, it's huge. And I think given the way the Premier League table is set up right now, where Bournemouth are doing really well, Nottingham Forest are in 3rd, they're obviously good teams. That's why they're so high up the table. But that's the kind of matches that I'd be willing to take a risk on later on. So because I know we've got more doubles later, I want to save the assistant managership and just try and get something with a bit more upside. If it was Liverpool home to Bournemouth, home to Everton, then home to Wolves, I would probably just use it. There's nothing wrong with going for a solid option rather than the table bonus. But if I do that, I want better fixtures. So slot is better than a 3rd Liverpool player in isolation. But as a whole, personally, I'd rather have the 3rd Liverpool player and just use the assistant manager on a different manager later on. So this is a good follow-on question. If Salah blanks in game week 23, would you still use triple captain on him in the double? So the simple answer to that question is yes, because what he does against Ipswich has no real bearing on what he's capable of doing in double game week 24. So I would still use the chip. The reason I selected this question is because some of you might be sat there with all of your chips, not really wanting to play the triple captain in 24, because potentially it's a bit of a dodgy double with 2 away games. When you're thinking about your chips, it's not necessarily, I know this is going to sound counterintuitive, but it's not necessarily about getting the best individual score. It's about getting the best combination of points. What I mean by that is, if you've got your triple captain and assistant manager, and you're looking at 24 thinking, it's not that great, I want to save them for doubles later on, you're going to run out of double game weeks. So if you think that double is not ideal for triple captain, then it's also not that ideal for assistant manager either. And the assistant manager chip is way more powerful than your triple captain. So if it's a choice between triple captain in 24 and assistant manager later, or the other way around, I'm sacrificing the triple captain chip in that double because that is the least powerful chip between the two. So if you're sat there with all your chips left, I'm definitely using my triple captain in 24 because I'd rather use the other chips in later doubles, and Salah is still capable of getting a good score in those fixtures. The other option is just to save it for a single game week, like maybe 28 against Southampton at home. But is that really better than having 2 matches? I would say probably not. So whatever he does against Ipswich, I think Salah is a great triple captain in 24. And I know it's easy to say because I've already used mine, but if I was sat here with my free hit wildcard bench boost assistant manager, which I still have, and my triple captain, I would be 99% using it on Salah in 24, saving the rest of the chips for later on in the season. So is it really worth bringing in Everton players for the upcoming double game week? Now, when I first read that question, I can't help but think we're going to be sat here in game week 25, those of us with 2 to 3 Everton players, with massive regret. Because 25 to 29, the fixture run is not that bad, but it's also not amazing. Palace away in 25, followed by Man United at home, Brentford away, Wolves away, and then the fixture in the blank is West Ham at home. Do I really want 3 Everton players for that? Probably not. So then there's quite a heavy reliance on them doing well against Leicester at home. So the answer to the question is it really worth it? I have a bad feeling it will end up not being worth it, but I may still go there for a couple of reasons, right? One, when I look at Jordan Pickford, he's the second highest scoring goalkeeper so far this season. Even if they don't keep clean sheets, he's very good for save points. And there is potential for clean sheets over that fixture run. So going from Raya to Pickford up until possibly wildcard 30, which I'm not fully locked into, but it is a definite possibility for me, that might not be the end of the world. So Pickford's probably okay. I've got a Dominic Solanke problem this week. And of course, I could go to Gakpo, but I might decide that I want a second defender instead. In which case, I might just go to Calvert-Lewin as a cheap option as my new 8th attacker and then pump that money into midfield instead. So as an example for my own team, I could go from, let's just put it in, Raya to Pickford, Solanke to Calvert-Lewin. I've got to search for him because he's not going to be very high up the points list. That would leave me with 2.7 million. So potentially I could upgrade Rodgers to a different midfielder. And bearing in mind Rodgers might blank in 29. And then all of a sudden Calvert-Lewin becomes my 8th attacker instead. So I would play him in the double with Leicester at home. The Liverpool game is a bit of a bonus. And I wouldn't necessarily have to rely on him very much over the next few game weeks. But that's a very niche problem for my team. You might be sat there with 3 great forwards, in which case you don't have to bring in Dominic Calvert-Lewin. And then with a defender like Mykolenko, if he keeps his place and they don't buy a new left back, you've got a 4.3 million defender you can play in the double, potentially rely on for some of those other fixtures, but for the most part, just bench him as your 4th or 5th defender. So as a collective, I look at it and think, do I really want to be stuck with 3 Everton players? Probably not. But in isolation, you can maybe make a case for all of them. If you don't want to buy an Everton attacker, just don't do it. Don't feel like you've got to. Like, I'm usually all in for the doubles, and I will definitely have 3 Liverpool players, no matter what. Everton players I'm not so worried about. And that's not usually the case for me in double game weeks. In seasons gone past, I'd always be on the triple up. I'm not sure if I will be there with Everton. I might be, but even that slight hesitation tells me that it might not be worth it. So the fixtures are okay. Individually, you can make a case for 1, 2, maybe 3 of them. Are you going to regret having all 3 in 25? Quite possibly. So Solanke is out of action for a nice run of Spurs fixtures. Would you give Son any consideration as a short-term punt instead of Mbeumo, Foden or Fernandes? Now, I did briefly this week look at Son myself because the next 4 game weeks are pretty nice. Leicester at home in 23, followed by Brentford away, Man United at home and Ipswich away. From 27, it gets a bit tougher. You've got City at home, then Bournemouth at home, and in 29, Spurs might blank. But even if you did get to 27 and 28, there are at least 2 home games. So Spurs players, I can see why people might look at them. I've kind of, not completely, but mostly written Son off as an option. And the reason is the opposite of what I think about Liverpool players right now. So over the last week or so, I've talked about the fact Liverpool have got rotatable fixtures. Champions League is done for them. Their FA Cup matches against Plymouth. They're going to rest players and they're going to concentrate on the Premier League. For Spurs, I worry it's going to be the other way around. They're obviously not doing well in the league right now. But let's be honest, they're not going to get pulled into a relegation battle. Spurs will still be in the Premier League next season. So the Premier League is kind of the least of their worries right now. They're much more reliant on the cup competitions. So it'll be interesting to see tomorrow what the first 11 is in the Europa League. Then you've got that Leicester game. Then you've got another Europa League game after that in the midweek. And they're going to want to finish in the top 8. Then you've got the Brentford game. Then you've got the semi-final with the Carabao Cup. That's huge. Spurs are going to put out their first choice 11 for that game. Then their FA Cup game is tough as well against Villa away. They're going to want to put out a full-strength side. And I'm not saying they're just going to not worry about playing Man United at home. But if they need to rest players after the Carabao Cup and FA Cup, they're more likely to do it in that game. So it's a weird situation where already at this early stage of the season, Spurs' focus is probably not on the Premier League. They're not going to get top 4 at this point. They're going to want to win those trophies instead. So it's not a case that I think Son will necessarily get benched over the next 4 game weeks. But if he can get brought off early, that's exactly what Ange Postecoglou will do. He might play 60 minutes against Leicester and get a hat-trick, right? It's definitely possible. But if I told you right now Son's not going to play 80 to 90 minutes in any of these games, and there is potential for 1 benching along the way, like, is he really worth it for 9.8? I'm picturing like Son doing really well in this next 4 game week run. But when I look at Spurs fixtures outside of that, I just worry a little bit. I've also put Richarlison on the graphic as a potential option because with the number of injuries they've got and him now being back, he will potentially play a little bit more. And he's listed as a forward only 6.8 million. but he doesn't have the greatest record of staying fit. And for the same reasons I've just mentioned, if they're going to rest him, potentially that will be in the Premier League. I'd be interested in hearing from Spurs fans in the comments below if you think what I'm saying is correct. I just think the focus has to be on the Cups for Spurs. And so if there's any rotation or reduction in minutes, it's probably going to be in the Premier League. And for 9.8 million for Son, even as a short-term punt, I'm not sure I can get there. But if you want to go for it, I certainly wouldn't talk you out of it. So what should we do with Martin Ødegaard? So let's look at the fixtures first of all. Game week 23, Wolves away, not bad. Game week 24, Man City at home. I would put that down as not amazing, but not terrible either. Then Leicester away in 25 is quite nice, and West Ham at home in 26 is pretty good as well. So I would say 3 of the next 4 are more than fine. He's nailed on, the minutes are good. I'm pretty sure he's still first choice penalty taker. I know he missed against Man United in the FA Cup, but then he went and scored in the shootout, the same shootout that Havertz missed in. So I would expect Ødegaard to take the next penalty. And when he does get returns, which admittedly haven't been very often recently, he is pretty good for bonus. He got 1 assist against Spurs, but finished on 8 points. So he's quite nice when he does get those bonus points. I basically wouldn't see Ødegaard as a massive problem. Like if you want to sell him, I don't have a huge issue with it whatsoever. I wouldn't sit here and argue about it. But I think he's okay to hold on to with the fixtures they've got. And if we look at the transfers in for midfielders this week, let's just run through and say who I would be happy to sell Ødegaard for. So Kluivert is fine, right? But there's obviously a bit of a reaction given the hat-trick. I think he's a perfectly reasonable, cheap option to bring in moving forward. I don't know if you need to do Ødegaard to Kluivert unless you really need the money. In my opinion, the boat's been missed on Foden. You should have bought him in before the good fixtures, not before the more difficult ones. Ahmad, like Kluivert, fine as a cheap option moving forward. If you need the money, then sell Ødegaard. Ødegaard to Mbeumo is probably a pretty good long-term move because Mbeumo also nailed on penalties and the fixtures are pretty good. But is he going to massively outscore Ødegaard over the next 4? I wouldn't be so sure about that. Rodgers, similar to Ahmad and Kluivert. Gordon, in my opinion, it might be the wrong time to bring him in. It's a really close one because 3 of the next 4 are actually pretty good. Southampton away, Fulham at home and Forest at home. But they do also have Man City away in between that, Liverpool away in 27 and a possible blank in 29. So I feel like with Gordon, if you don't own him, you've got to take the short-term pain and just ignore him. Luis Diaz, I kind of already spoken about. He's fine, but I prefer Gakpo from Liverpool attackers. Matoma's, again, just a bit of recency bias. He was benched for the 2 games before. He's just played back-to-back 90s with fatigue, right? So he might just be fully back in the team now, but I don't know if you want to bring him in. You get the point, right? There's lots of midfielders that people are bringing in, like Trossard, Kulusevski. They're not players I would buy for Ødegaard, so I just don't see him as a massive problem. And I feel like a lot of the midfielders that people are bringing in, unless it's for cash, they're probably slightly sideways moves. So I think for a lot of you should probably hold on to him if you can withstand the pain of how much or how frustrating it is when he blanks, which he has done a lot recently. And obviously Arsenal are not necessarily in a great place without Saka either. So I wouldn't say he's a must hold, absolutely not. But I think he is okay to hold if you've got other important things to do instead. So I was a little bit surprised to get this question. Can I jump off Cole Palmer until game week 27? I was even more surprised to see that no midfielder has had more transfers out so far this week than Cole Palmer. So some people have had enough. Frustratingly blanked against Wolves in game week 22, absolutely. But the previous 4 game weeks, he had 3 10-pointers. Only Salah has scored more points than him so far this season. It does feel a little bit crazy to be thinking about getting rid of him. If I could play devil's advocate for a second, though, it is 3 away games in the next 4. So Man City away in 23, Brighton away in 25, Villa away in 26, and the home game is West Ham in game week 24. So it's not an amazing fixture run, but I don't look at it as terrible either. And the key thing for me is it's Southampton at home in 27 and Leicester at home in 28. If he's fit, you're almost certainly going to want him in your team. Even with the Arsenal fixture in 29, you just don't care about that because of how good the fixtures are before. Southampton and Leicester, potential captaincy opportunities. I just don't think you want to give him up. So for me, it feels like a bit of a frivolous, I don't think I've ever said that word on this channel, a frivolous use of 2 transfers because he's almost a guarantee to have to bring back if he's fit. And some people will lose team value along the way. Now, if people keep transferring him out, his price might come down. So you might not lose as much team value. But when we're at a stage of FPL where there's a double next week in 24, a blank in 29, you might not want to use chips. Transfers are precious. using one to get rid of Palmer and one to bring him back, it doesn't feel right to me. Now, I'll be honest, I hadn't really considered selling Palmer, so I've not given it a huge amount of thought. Maybe you could do like Palmer to Son as a short-term punt, free up some money, get Gakpo in as another forward or whatever it might be. You can afford Van Dijk, and then you figure out how to get him in later. Maybe there's something cool that people can do. And can you jump off? Of course, it's your team. But for most people, I just think it makes very little sense. If he gets a return against City, all of a sudden he's got a return in the most difficult fixture over the next 6. And then the fixture run looks much better all of a sudden. And he's more than capable of getting a return against Man City away. So you can jump off. I think for most people, I'd probably advise against it. If you enjoyed that video, make sure to give it a like and hit that subscribe button. Rate 5 stars if you're listening on podcast. And I'll be back tomorrow with a team selection video.